Rob Glen. I'm with Bloomberg's New Energy Finance Group. I'm based in San Francisco, and we are responsible basically for commercial stuff in the Western U.S. for the company. We're part of the bigger Bloomberg, founded by Mike Bloomberg, and as such, I'm part of a multi-headed hydra of an organization that actually does have its sort of tentacles into or heads into lots of different parts of the climate story. With me are actually prominent members of the sort of investment community, as I see it, Nancy Pfund, Peter Light, and Danny Kennedy. I'm going to have them introduce themselves in a bit, but first what I wanted to do was tell you a little bit about myself and sort of some of the perspectives we have on the opportunity, or the challenge first, and the opportunity associated with it. When I was actually, I wouldn't say I was recruited. I knocked on the door of Michael Liebreich, our founder, and said, I'd like to open up an office for you guys in the West Coast. And that's what we did. Michael was very obsessed with the early stage investment community. While I had doubts about whether that would be basically our primary market, I went ahead and started to try to build up our relationship base on Sand Hill Road. And it was with people like Nancy Floyd, John Doerr, her partner now, Ira Ehrenpreis, Vinod Khosla, Tim Draper of Draper Fisher Jurvetson, and then Nancy Pfund. What actually happened is that our company actually, much like I think the rest of the industry, reflected a dramatic shift in who got involved and who really dominated as the cost of PV and wind and other technologies came down, and policy was very supportive. Nancy's still a celebrity, but most of the people actually we work with tend to be faces in the crowd that you see here. And our client base actually is essentially the strategic investors, the policymakers who are deeply involved in advancing sort of the forward advance of green power in the grid, EVs on the ground, and the like. And they are increasingly being sort of matched up by companies that have been mentioned earlier today, who actually are taking the law into their own hands. Where utilities aren't providing them a green product, they're going out and doing power purchase agreements with power developers, and upping the game for everybody. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Going back to sort of where finance meets ideas, we've historically tracked capital flows into clean energy. Actually, it was with the root of the business. While Michael was really focused very heavily on the guys and gals on Sand Hill Road, we started actually focusing very closely on investment in assets, wind farms, solar farms, other kinds of power projects. And as you can see from this chart, which is the classic waterfall chart that shows essentially capital deployed either as sort of greenfield investment, secondary investment, or actually M&A transactions, getting up to over $400 billion a year. $400 billion, which is still well shy of what we have estimated needs to be spent in order to get to the carbon emissions reduction that we're all looking to see. If you look to the left-hand side, you'll see where venture capital kind of fits in the spectrum. It kind of gives you perspective. But as a person who worked in Wall Street for a bit, you don't want to see tons of early-stage capital being spent, where frankly it doesn't need to be. Private equity and other kinds of capital can take later-stage ideas, but that little bit of seed or Series A's capital can really make a difference. And so that's about the right amount. And what we're seeing, actually, and this is our latest numbers through the first quarter of 17, is that there's been basically a steady flow. A lot of people say that clean tech VCs have gone by the wayside, and for the most part, a lot of firms have pulled back, individual firms, but there's still a fair amount of venture and early stage capital being deployed. And I think that's something we'll talk about as well. What we're really here, though, is to in the context of the conference is, getting to 100% renewables. It's something we're talking about, obviously, here in California. Doing it in, the rest of the world is obviously going to be very challenging. What we do every year in June, and we'll be updating it next month, is our 2040 forecast of what the energy mix is going to look like globally. And here I've more or less taken some regional perspectives. And in each case, you can see solar and wind getting a bigger share of the market than it has today. But at the same time, you see fossil fuels still accounting for a very big chunk of the energy mix. And the question is, what can we do kind of in the moonshot category? And that's why one of the reasons why it's good to have Peter Light here to possibly sort of accelerate that time to market for renewables. So with that, I wanted to reintroduce my panel colleagues here and have them basically sort of tell you a little bit about their firm and kind of what their firm's respective mission statements are and where they play in the funding environment. Nancy?
All right. Well, thanks for that introduction and overview. It's really helpful. And thanks for inviting me today. 100% renewables, something I used to dream about. Glad to know it's going to happen. So really appreciate all of the effort to pull together thought leaders and such. So DBL stands for Double Bottom Line. It's a firm that I founded when I spun out of JP Morgan back in 2008, where I worked at JP Morgan for many years before then. And it stands, the double bottom line, what that means is that we invest for both top-tier financial return, like any other VC does, including the ones on Sand Hill Road from Rob's photo there. But we don't stop there. We also invest for a second bottom line, which is to drive significant social, economic, and environmental improvement in the regions and sectors in which we invest. And we started doing this back in 2004 with some early investments in companies like Powerlight that was sold to SunPower, SolarCity, Tesla, just a whole Nextracker, a bunch of companies that have really helped define what the 21st century energy landscape will look like, to sort of be the forerunners. And that's really our job, is to try to be, a good 10 years ahead of the curve in terms of understanding where disruption will result in the creation of iconic large companies that employ a lot of people. So the field that we're in is now called impact investing. That term didn't exist when we started, but it's become extremely popular as people realize that it's not enough just to vote at the polls. You've got to vote with your portfolio. You've got to make some decisions about what your money is doing when you're asleep and when you're awake as well. So that's what we do. We really have intentionality when it comes to investing in companies that will build a sustainability economy for decades to come and redefine this century as a clean energy economy. And so we start with really little companies, but we help them grow. And ideally, either in the way we get paid, the way our investors get paid, is to have those companies go public or to be sold. And so we work with our companies to help them be successful. We also engage in a huge amount of policy work with our companies, because in the various fields of impact, you're solving multi-trillion-dollar problems. And so anytime there's $1 trillion lying around, you're going to have government policy be important. So it's kind of different from some of the more traditional aspects of venture capital that way. So we really do navigate and jump in. We don't win all the policy battles we fight, but we win a lot of them. And that's a little bit different than the traditional approach to venture capital, which is kind of a more hands-off. We believe that to be a really good impact investor, you have to engage, you have to jump in. And it's something we enjoy, and it's obviously been something that's helped to make us successful, so that we can raise larger and larger funds to go after, the next generation of clean energy companies. So I'm thrilled to be here.
before Peter goes, I think Nancy may be the most successful venture investor, really, in terms of unit volume of investments, IRR, and that's why she was on that second screen as a survivor.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think.
Peter, this isn't your first rodeo working in clean energy. Tell us a little bit about you and X.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I will say I really want to give a shout out to Angelina in putting this whole group together. It's just, I've had so many great conversations with so many of you in the halls and in the evening. So it's really a treat to be here. Let me tell you about X. We are what we call ourselves a moonshot factory. So we're really out to invent and to launch breakthrough technologies that can make the world a radically better place. So that's our mission. We like to take on things that we feel are, might be uncomfortably ambitious, but where we might be able to really peer around the horizon, particularly starting with a problem. And sometimes we don't really know how to get there. And actually, I think that's why it's so relevant in this conversation. It really begins by defining, what that goal is, and the declaration of 100% renewable. In my decades of experience working in renewables, this conversation it still feels very new. And I think it's so powerful to actually begin here, and then you start to look, well, what do we actually need to go do, and what have we learned across the world? And I think that's one of the wonderful things that's coming to bear here. At X, you asked about how we're set up. We have, we've taken on projects like a self-driving car, which you're probably familiar with. When we started that in 2009, it was, that was sort of crazy talk, and now it's, radically becoming or quickly becoming, sort of an inevitability, it seems. And so we're really curious as we look forward to a world that is 100% renewable, and in other areas, what are the kinds of technologies and business models that might be required to bring that forward. I will also say of course, we're deeply affiliated and sort of part of the family with Google. Google's in December committed to procure 100% of its energy use, including for its data centers, from renewable energy. And to do that, I know the team very well who has pulled that off, and it was quite a bit more than simply going to write a check. It was an exceptional endeavor to get there, and there's a lot more to be done. So we've seen that in both our procurement, but also in the operations of our buildings and campuses. We've created programs to allow free electric vehicle charging, and as a result, we've had a huge influx of EVs in our parking lots. And you go talk to the building manager, and they see the huge demand charge spike early in the day, and you start to look at that, and you're like, maybe there's another way to do that. And so we've touched this world in different areas, and are exploring how we might participate.
Michael. So my name's Danny Kennedy. Hi, everyone. Thank you also for having me here, Angelina, and the host committee, David et al. It's a privilege to be here, and it's fun to be actually talking about 100% in a way that feels real. And we've got senators standing up and proposing legislation to do it. It's no longer just this sort of crazy talk, which is wonderful. My role in that transition is to run something called the California Clean Energy Fund. We're actually a non-profit, but a fund of a sort. And our mission is 100% for the 100%. So, we really see our role as both continuing to drive innovation in technology and finance in particular, which is key to this story, but to do it in a way that makes sure we lift all boats. And by that, we don't just mean participation in employment or as customers, but that 100% of the community is benefiting from the clean economy as it rises in terms of ownership and leadership of that as well. So the diversification of the characters in the room over time. We had the women's panel before lunch, which was wonderful, and thank you for that leadership. We've got to continue to do that and make sure minorities, people of color, and others are in this. And one of the reasons why we've adopted that commitment to build equity into the clean economy in California. As a 12-year-old institution doing this work now, that's sort of a new emphasis of ours, is because of the politics of the thing. You know, it is the Latino legislature that is leading us down this path. It is, you know, a Mexican-American born of an immigrant single mother passing or introducing at least the 100% legislation, passing the 50% legislation. It's Ben Hueso, a dual citizen carrying a Mexican passport as well, on the Energy Committee that is going to make this stuff happen. And they're asking us as an industry, how do we ensure that the entire community is benefiting from this in all the ways that it should benefit, including ownership and leadership of the industry. So we're working on that in our programs, which are basically three, but the main one is the fund, which is currently a $24 million fund, which we just launched this year, really. We contracted to run it for the California Energy Commission last year, but it is to fund pre-prototype startups in the clean energy space over the next 5 years. So we're meant to find 100 cool companies and give them pretty small chunks of change, up to $600,000 each, plus a bunch of training, mentoring, and support to succeed, so that people like Nancy and others can pick them up and take them out into the world. But we're trying to find the people with ideas, not a lot more than that. In fact, we're not meant to fund them if they're at sort of pilot phase or at revenue, and get them into the wild, as it were. So the CalCEF Fund, we're about to announce our first 8 investees, and we'll be doing 100, as I said, over the next 4 years. We also run a program in conjunction with the national labs, and I see Doug Rotman in the room from Lawrence Livermore, which is one of our partners, on CalCharge, which is trying to drive energy storage to continue to innovate, and California's leadership in batteries is unparalleled. About 85% of all the IP and all the batteries in the cars and the devices you're all holding in your hands are Californian IP. And we're trying to continue to drive that leadership with this consortium of companies, universities, the national labs, and the unions, the IBEW NECA significantly, to do everything from innovation through installation and workforce development to maintain our leadership in energy storage. And then the third program is a network of incubators and accelerators, which we really just launched about 18 months ago, where we're basically trying to share kind of Silicon Valley smarts and how California can do support for entrepreneurs can be shared with the rest of the world. There are all these other emerging markets that need entrepreneurs now, because it's wonderful to have the policy settings to create the market, but if that's not followed with a crowding in of companies to try to create the actual work and the businesses, then it may not amount to much. And supporting entrepreneurs is not as natural to much of the world as it is in California. So sharing that, but also learning from the Chinese, the Indonesians, the Thais, the Brazilians, et cetera, about how they support entrepreneurs, maybe without a VC community in their country, but with bootstrapping and old-fashioned ways of doing business. You know, that's what we're trying to get, a peer-to-peer learning, and we now have about 25 incubators and accelerators in that international network, with about half a dozen here in California as the core of it. And just to that and to the topic of the panel, you know, I just point out that the $400 billion a year that we're getting in clean energy these days, it's an amazing number. It's not anywhere near what we probably need. As Bloomberg and others project, it's closer to $1 trillion. But then again, you know, that is still $1 billion and a bit dollars a day. And it's about what we spend on auto loans in America. Just, you know, to give you a sense, we do about $1 trillion worth of mortgages annually in America. So like, the world has to get to what we spend on mortgages in America annually to make this clean energy transition to 100% for the globe. It's actually not that big a lift. The missing piece, in my view, is not capital. There's plenty of that sitting on the sidelines, not making much of a return, could easily flow into this space. It is companies, it is entrepreneurs that will make it happen. To create $1 trillion worth of value annually for the next 25 years, we need 1,000 successful billion-dollar businesses. We need about 5 Elon Musks a month, just to give you a number to think about. He's got a big family, but you need a lot more entrepreneurs to succeed. So, you know, my pitch to you is to think about how we spawn and support people to take the leap, to start companies, to spread this joy we call clean energy.
Thank you. You know, as my own company's sort of experience told me, I mean, the world became commoditized, you know, quickly, you know, as we saw the kit come down in price. So as investors, what's the balance between technology innovation and business model innovation that as you kind of sort of see your portfolios or your own activities expand?
Well, we actually talk about a trifecta. It's policy, it's innovation, and it's capital. And in our view, you need all three of those to be kind of in the same direction in order to make these breakout successful investments. And the good news is that California really leads at that. And just going through, the 13 years of our portfolio, when we invested in Powerlight, which was the first really big solar integrator that was eventually sold to SunPower and became its distribution arm, Powerlight wasn't heavily funded by venture capitalists. It relied on CEC grants. It got 2 or 3 of those at critical times from the California Energy Commission, and that helped launch that company. Then you look at the rooftop solar industry, Solar City being one of the participants there. Obviously, the ITC at the federal level was very important for that financial innovation business model that you alluded to. But it was also here in California that California Solar Initiative rebate that was a huge driver of adoption beyond just the early adopter, higher income segment. So again, policy led to to making us feel good about our investment in Solar City. With Tesla, lots of different policies. Here in California, again, the zero emission vehicle credit that Tesla started receiving when it didn't really have a lot of car revenues. That was the main source of revenue in the old days, was that ZEV credit they got from Honda and others that couldn't meet the requirements of the law in California to sell a certain number of electric vehicles. So that was critically important. And then to your point about how we lead in storage, we've made several storage investments. One of them we wouldn't have made had it not been for the CPUC procurement policy that came out a few years ago, mandating 1,300 megawatts of storage purchases by California utilities. And that allowed a company in our portfolio, Advanced Microgrid Solutions, run by a woman, by the way, to get a 50 megawatt contract from SoCalEd right out of the gate, which is unheard of. There's also something called, there's a rebate called for behind the meter storage called the S-chip. I could go on and on and on, but this is really important to understand that policy does create the environment for successful investing. It's not 100% foolproof, but I mean, the examples I just gave you are pretty compelling. And so that's why it's so exciting to be thinking about 100% renewables policy, because who knows? I mean, there are going to be so many innovations that stem from that.
Yeah, well, in restaurants, usually they start out local, maybe go regional, and then Wall Street takes them public because they've been able to sort of make a national case. California has very aggressive policy, but its neighboring states, not necessarily as strong, and then you get out to other parts of the country. As an investor, how do you see, basically your time to exit, when arguably, businesses need to expand beyond their sort of home turf?
Well, I mean, the good news again about California that it actually is a huge market in itself. So you can, and I don't know what percentage of rooftop solar still California represents, but I bet it's of the nation. I bet it's still pretty high. So I always tell people, because people are always saying, well, will this work anywhere else than California? I'm like, calm down. It will happen, but California is a really good place to start. I do, the good news is that the second and third largest states in our country, so California, Texas, Florida, where a lot of people live. I mean, Nevada is infamous, now famous for its solar policy roller coaster. What, 3 million people live in Nevada, and I'm not I mean, it's a great state and all, but like 18 million people live in Florida, and it's just entering its infancy when it comes to solar. And same with Texas, which is obviously a wind leader, but just beginning. So the fact that that California led for years and years and years we should be used to that by now. And I'm really excited to see the second and the third largest states here with lots of people, lots of sunshine, now enter the phase of solar mainstreaming.
Now, Peter, you've spent some time at Google, you were at Bloom, you understand sort of companies that make decisions about data center siting. And the policy issue does come up sometimes when people are looking to build assets in their in new states. Tell us a little bit about your experience and how you see that driving policy across the U.S. at least, if not abroad.
Something that comes to mind that's apropos of this conference and in multiple layers is actually an announcement that was made not by Google, by a partner of ours, Mid-American Energy. Bill Fairman, CEO, just committed that there would be 100% renewable, and this is in Iowa as really leveraged by wind power, and so a lot of that is going to be one of the largest local investments that the state's seen in infrastructure. So that's something I think that we can all look to and sort of see how we could allow that in different places. I think for to your prior question around business model. I think something that we've seen here is a number of the policies that Nancy highlighted, I think, that have been so great for California to deal with the issue at hand in renewables historically was around cost reduction and making it available for people to get there. And I think that where we're starting to see is a transition point, which is, we're in this place where solar's gotten to be so cheap and other technologies are integrating that there's this other dimension of integrating. And I think as I look ahead, the place I get really curious is on the value side of these different technologies and their capabilities to integrate with a grid. There's some discussion about what it might take to go from 20 to 30 to 50% is going to be different than what it takes to go from 50% and beyond. And so I think there are a number of features technically about localized siting and localized voltage control, things like that, that are not fully realized today that could be.
Mm-hmm. Danny, if you were to start a solar company again, what would it look like, and where would you like it to be in 5 to 10 years in terms of not just size, but what it's offering to its customers?
So the reference there was to, I helped start Sungevity, which is one of the companies in the space over the last decade that kind of pioneered remote solar design, which helped change the game. And I also helped start a company called Mosaic, which now does sort of $1 billion worth of solar loans annually, and have been involved with some other startups in the space. And if I were to start from scratch, I would go to emerging markets. There's 1 billion humans on Earth that don't currently benefit from the thing we take for granted called electricity. They're going to get it in the next couple of decades. We have the technology. It's not a moonshot. It's pretty straightforward. It's a deployment business, and it crushes economically. It makes a shit ton of money, throws cash off. So, I mean, it's not my business. I'm running the California Clean Energy Fund, but if there are any entrepreneurs out there and are wondering where to go to start a really big fuck-off company that's going to be a household name in 10 years, it's called Emerging Market Solar Plus Storage.
We did one of those.
Yeah. Well, Nancy has a portfolio that includes off-grid electric.
Which is bringing solar and storage rooftop to Africa, to rural villages, and just has already hundreds of thousands of customers for lower cost than what they're paying now for a terrible product like kerosene.
Which is an awesome story, incredible case. But just to remind you all, a couple 100,000 customers, there's a couple billion people, because there's also there's the billion that don't have it currently and 1 billion about to be born that won't have it in those markets. So, we're talking about companies that will address hundreds of millions of humans with AC electricity service. This will get better than solar lamps and household solar systems. This will be full-scale AC done by solar and batteries, mediated by smart devices developed in countries and states like California and sold to the world. And that is one of the biggest economic moments ever, actually. Like that's as big as the internet.
And the
et cetera.
company, the off-grid, while it operates in Africa, it has a core group in the Bay Area because of the need to leapfrog and get that technology both on the AC side, also the appliance. We just went into Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa, and we thought people would buy the low-end system, which was basically a light and a panel and a battery. But the higher-end system included a really nice, very energy-efficient TV, but with a big screen. We ran out of those TVs like in weeks. So people are willing to save and kind of carve out their monthly payment in order to live the life that we all take for granted.
There are two stories here that I'm hearing. One, California as a leader, inspirer, but also as a beneficiary of some of the businesses that are serving these markets. What's your perspective on what California actually will learn from some of these other markets as what basically off-the-shelf technology, maybe a few low-power devices getting out there in terms of integration, some of the issues that I know Angelina's trying and others are trying to deal with as renewables become more penetrated on the grid?
Well, I think you will see, as Danny alluded to, you will see this AC model. You'll see in Africa and other places, you'll see sharing of electricity before you see it here because of some of the leapfrogging that's going on.
I can offer something, please.
Go.
I think something that is that's looming large for me in this conversation is that the paradigm that we have today here, I think something that has been maybe a sort of shadow conversation is how do we transition to the new model we're envisioning, and sort of how do we carry along the legacy infrastructure or the folks that operate that legacy infrastructure? And I don't think that problem set exists in the same way in some of these areas, so I think that could be something where we might look to see what happens.
Yeah.
I mean, just to further point that it's an interesting place to look at when the digital camera arose, and Kodak kept making chemical film. When that sort of tipped over, we didn't say, hey, wait, we got to bring Kodak along, and that's the whole process. And we do in this situation, and we do for valid reasons, but really identifying what those reasons are, I think is a really great place to look now as we design the next generation policies.
To your question and your point, I think we're in a position now to learn from these leapfrog markets as we backfill our existing markets with new innovation and stuff. Just as an example, companies using blockchain. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the blockchain, but we've got a great little startup in Oakland called the Sun Exchange, which is financing solar microgrids in Lesotho, Southern Africa, on the blockchain. And the deal and the crowdfunding is all using Bitcoins and Ethereum for contracting and all that stuff that I can barely explain to you. But will become, if you trust the Germans, will become a key part of the integration of the energy web as it grows. And so we're going to learn by doing first in these emerging leapfrog markets. And that's the amazing moment we're in. Like we were saying at the start of this panel, to be talking seriously about 100% is a fantastic privilege. We had to cross this bridge called gas, or so we thought. Finally, we're hopefully going to get off that thing. The good news and I wanted to say this to our friends from Mexico, they don't have to make that mistake. They don't have to cross that bridge. They can go straight to the promised land. They can be there in a 100% electrification scenario with clean energy inputs pretty soon without having to do gas infrastructure in the meantime. So that's the sort of opportunity to learn from emerging markets for a place like California as it tries to get all the way.
We've talked about solar, wind. We haven't really talked about fuels much, and hydrogen, other sort of alternatives. When somebody comes with a business plan, I mean, either of you guys or maybe even Google, which stack is it put on?
The alternative fuels?
Yeah.
We're kind of bought into the electrification model, so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I got to say, I mean, to me, we've just received over 700 startup applications for 2 programs, the Pfund and for an accelerator we're running with 8 utilities. And there were biofuels and other businesses in there, hydrogen and other, but they're definitely decreasing in percentage, I think, at least coming to us. And you look at them and their economics and their requirements for support and wild assumptions, you know, like versus we're seeing real contracts for electricity from wind and solar farms at the lowest cost ever in history from any technology, and storage is almost getting there too because it's on a cost down trajectory like those were. I mean, you can't beat it.
And also the reality, of course we need charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, no doubt about it. But as someone that's owned an electric car since 2012, I've only used a charger on the road like 3 times because most of my driving is around my home and around my work, and I charge at home. So, and it's, I mean, I haven't been to a gas station in years. Why would I want to go to a station when I can do it in the comfort of my own home?
So thinking about demand side technologies and really getting right into the sort of thick of really what the major topic du jour, it's not so much, you know, how cheap can solar get, but, you know, what's the opportunity for transportation and how does that integrate with generation? You know, we've been talking a little bit about some of the new sort of policy initiatives, and Danny, I think, you know, there's one that's really exciting. I don't know if you want to share your thoughts on kind of, you know, what really needs to be the catalyst here for, you know, getting up to what could be 5 million
Sure.
EVs on the road.
So, you know, just to share the joy and the irony of the learning that we're going through right now, which is that to get to 100% renewable, taking out transport actually makes that more viable and possible and achievable. You know, I think that's a wonderful solution because transport, because of our success on renewables for the electricity grid, has become the biggest climate problem. So now we can address both in this agenda to get to 100% renewable. And the bill that Rob's mentioned is one that's pending that didn't get much time because of the 100% bill, which is also very significant. But I think it's a companion bill that's being proposed by Phil Ting up in the State House to do 5 million EVs as a mandate by 2025. And, you know, that's a big step up in the electric vehicle market. And the theory is that it would be used to balance and take down oversupply, so-called, of renewable generation. And by rebating citizens of California to get EVs and changing the rates and tariff systems and incentives, you would have a situation where, you know, you could both get a really reasonably priced electric vehicle and you could get paid to fill it up on a windy, sunny Sunday, which is a kind of a beautiful vision from all the equity points of view as well. But, you know, 5 million EVs to balance the grid as we go to higher and higher penetration of renewables is one of these kind of step change, game changing Californian kind of vision things that, like the CSI, will attract thousands of bright minds and entrepreneurs and people that will try to build the EV charging infrastructure and will try to build the software that, you know, manages the perfect arbitrage of electrons to maximize the money from the new rate structures and all that sort of stuff. So it's this economic moment, an opportunity to unleash the entrepreneurs of California to actually do something meaningful rather than the mom tech and the sex tech that they're otherwise building. It's a good news story.
Yeah. In the time before we go to questions, you know, who are the kind of investment partners that you're seeing that are coming on the horizon now? You know, not necessarily the GEs of this world, but other large capital providers. I mean, as you said, I mean, there is a lot of capital interested in good ideas, but there is, you know, historically been, you know, at least, you know, historically, last 10 years, a reluctance to get back into, you know, clean tech. You know, tell us who are the sort of new categories that you're working with?
Yeah, well, fortunately, there are new categories, and we kind of call the period back in the sort of 2006 to 2012. I mean, there were kind of tourists that were coming from other sectors and wanting to get into this clean tech thing, and many of them, you know, just it didn't work out, and so they're back doing their tech or life science or whatever, which is good because the people that remain are committed and smart and experienced. And what we're seeing is that we're increasingly partnering with, I would say, three classes. One is family offices that are heavily into impact and have a lot of capital to deploy and want it to match their values. So we co-invest with those groups quite a lot, and of course they're huge family offices across the globe. The second would be the incumbents that used to minimize the significance of the clean energy new entrants, and by that I mean utilities and oil and gas companies that are, facing the inevitable, and maybe they're just hedging their bets, but at least, we'll take their capital, because it will educate them as they help to support this next generation. And then the third is overseas corporations are especially active in this field, seeing the opportunity to, for example, in Africa, our Africa company, Off-Grid Electric, EDF, the big French, one of the largest utilities in the world, a huge nuclear fleet. They've been in Africa for 100 years. They realize they have nothing to sell Africa as the world goes clean, and so they invested with us in Off-Grid Electric to leverage the fact that they have brand, they have people, they have infrastructure, and sell something that is really necessary and desired on that continent going forward.
Peter, what can you say that Google's doing?
Sure. Well, I can just add a couple observations. I'd say in addition that I've personally seen quite an interest from the oil and gas community of just a beyond flirtatious, a real extensive curiosity of saying of how to leverage this enormous technical capacity that exists in those organizations and direct that in a way. And so I see that trend happening. But the other side, I'll say, is I think we tend to look perhaps on the chart about the investment that goes into the companies, but one other side that drives it is the procurement itself, the demand. And so I know there was the gentleman who's going to be here from General Motors is representing corporate renewable purchases. So, Google has been a leader there, but many other companies are now too. And so I imagine when, if I were an entrepreneur showing up at, your organization or your organization, and I said, I have signed orders. I not only have a great idea, but I have signed orders. That changes the tipping point of getting that investment, catalyzing it.
Yep, for sure.
We have some time for questions.
I'm Joe Galliani. I am the chair of South Bay Clean Power CCA initiative in Los Angeles County. And my question ties into a little bit about what you talked about, Peter, in terms of the oil and gas company. And I want to put from a financial spectrum, just transition on the table. How do we take our workers throughout the oil, coal, and gas industries and bring them into renewable energy without giving them a $15 an hour panel slapping job? How do we guarantee that if you're making $100,000 a year with Cadillac benefits at Chevron, that you transition to a $100,000 a year job with Cadillac benefits and get paid to be retrained? Where does that money come from?
Well, I mean, it is happening. I mean, and actually solar wages are higher than average. They're more in the $20 to $24 an hour as an entry level. If you are promoted in companies like Solar City, Tesla, Sunrun, and you run a crew or you run several crews, you can make $100,000.
But you can't be in a union, though, right?
Well, they don't. I mean, that doesn't need to be a union. I mean, most of unions play a role, but not in most California industries. I think they're 13% of the workforce. So
probably a much higher percentage of the workforce in energy.
Well, but I mean, if we're talking about California transitioning from the oil and gas and coal to solar, we're doing that. Solar employs 200,000 people, and which is more than oil and gas combined. So there are all kinds of retraining efforts that go on. I know that in Utah, Solar City has hired people from the coal industry and trained them, and they get the new energy jobs have a career path just that has a lot of upside. So I don't really think it's a fair assessment to say that these people are going to not have the ability to have quality jobs, because the evidence suggests just the opposite. Plus, they're much more accessible. They're more racially diverse, more gender diverse than the industries you've talked about. You don't see a lot of women in the coal industry.
So, just sorry to, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but it's a challenging question, no doubt. And it's one of the reasons that there's friction in the system. The IBEW, NECA have famously been challenged by the solar industry in California, shall we say, and therefore challenged it back. We have on our board the IBEW NECA's sustainability director as an effort to try to work out how to build these bridges and work this out. But I firstly think this is not a world of guarantees. I mean, there's one answer to your question. I don't think we can guarantee a guy a $100,000 salary in this industry or any industry right now. But the energy industry is going through an era of disruption in a 5-year, 10-year period, unlike any it has had for a century. So, don't count on nothing. But we will employ many more people, because by the numbers, we're 3 to 7 times at least more job dense than fossil fuels. That's just a fact, and that will get, flatten out a bit through time. But even though our costs are less, we employ 3 or 7 times as many people. So it's a great job creator. Will they be union jobs? Will they be demarcated by the right union? Will they employ your guys on $100,000 salaries? I don't know. And I think there's lots of arguments about that. The assumption is because solar's an electrical technology, IBEW needs to do it. But actually, to a lot of union workers, it looks more like an SEIU type function. It's labor plus maintenance over a 25-year period. That could be an SEIU role. So I think it's a pretty complicated conversation, but it needs to be taken on by the unions as equally as it is by the industry to think about the changes and challenges it poses. I will say that I think there's an amazing opportunity in America with batteries. Batteries, as they've been driven, lithium ion in particular, has been driven by devices that you're all holding. And that's fine to make centrally in Asia, which is currently the situation. Korea, China, Asia makes all the batteries. Apple are the biggest consumer of batteries by megawatt in the world for iPhones. But as that shifts from devices to vehicles, the battery stacks, the cell stacks that go in a vehicle are just too big to make in Asia and ship across the Pacific to a market like the United States. That's why Tesla's Gigafactory is here, in fact. And more importantly, they're on a train line from Reno, Nevada to Fremont, California, because if they were trucking the same distance, their costs would be far greater. Train is very important in that logistics scenario. Long story short, there's gigafactories, not just the one, but many of them to be built to get 5 to 10 million electric vehicles being made in America, and Trump's America, where he wants to keep car manufacturing. So you're going to have lots of battery factories. We don't have workers trained to do that work.
Well, but they're in the Reno area. There are workforce training programs that are being built. And I mean, look at Tesla. You've got tens of thousands of employees there, where the GM and the Toyota plant fired 5,000 people. And now it's the largest manufacturing company in the state. So, and they're very well-paying jobs.
All I'm trying to say is that's a good example of what could be 20 times X, 20 times that. That's the good news.
Yeah, Mark.
Mark Gold from UCLA. So you talked a great deal about the electrification, and I was just wondering, from the standpoint of goods movement, shipping, air travel, we didn't really hear much there. What are the sorts of things that you guys are thinking about in those spaces?
Well, clearly, fleets and trucks and different fuels for airplanes. I mean, those are all part of the mix, and I think you're seeing buses. Proterra, I think, is here today. I mean, there are definitely 21st century versions of the 20th century products that are being made. Some of those won't be venture opportunities. Some will come from larger companies developing.
But I was thinking more of the goods movement side of the equation, rather than the people moving in a city. So it's sort of the long distance. How do you move, stuff through shipping or through air travel or through trains, those sorts of things.
Yeah, well, I will add quickly that there, and this is, been announced by our CEO. We did look at actually very large blimps to transport, goods. I mean, cargo shipping across the seas, very, very high emissions. So that's an area that we've explored. But I think more to your question, I ordered a burrito the other day at my home, and it was $7, and it arrived in 10 minutes, and it was delivered by someone in a 4,000-pound car. And I said, that just can't make sense. Like, that can't continue. So I think that's an area where the advent of drones, perhaps, or other kinds of delivery, in urban goods, we do it very inefficiently today, and I think there might be other ways to accomplish that.
And certainly autonomous drive is one way to approach that with better mapping tools and such, and those are areas we're involved in.
Electric trains for long distance as well as for urban and interurban use, and that's another great job opportunity and hopefully a way to lift all boats and involve more of the community. And one interesting thing that California's kind of leading on is the electrification of ports, because while shipping is a big contributor, much of that is while at berth. And so I think it's Long Beach, right, that's doing 100% electrification, which is the second largest port on the West Coast, I believe. And that is a wonderful example of what could be done. The technologies involved are all entrepreneurial opportunities.
You, and then I'll come to you next.
So my name is Alex McDonald. I'm a graduate student here at UC Irvine. And you asserted you need more Elon Musks. So if you help me get the resources, I'll volunteer. But more to my question, what do you see as the sort of legislative or economic tipping point for microgrids here in the Western world? You mentioned, there's high growth in the developing world. What's holding us back? And is there something in particular you see that once that tilts, microgrids will take off here? And then, beyond that, what's your favorite emerging market for microgrids at the moment? Thanks.
Well, I think microgrids are developing here. I mean, the company that I mentioned has some of the SoCal water districts that already have solar, but that have very extensive energy requirements and peaks. And they're just, once you load in some storage and some software that allows you to switch from one to the other, and you can reshape your load with these. And so this is what will be commonplace as we get cheaper storage and the ability to take the power from the grid when the grid is healthy and not overtaxed and it's cheap. Take it from your rooftop when the sun is shining. Take it from your battery when the grid is already overtaxed. I mean, this is, and all of the tariffs and the fees that you'll pay are calculated so that this choice happens without your even knowing it. I mean, and that's here today.
Yeah, and I can add to that I think one of the things that is happening already is particularly businesses are looking and saying, am I okay with the level of reliability and availability on the grid at large to operate my business? And for most, it is okay. Yet we get just sort of one flat plan for everyone. And if you just think of your sort of cell phone bill, that's sort of absurd that we would do that. And so companies are taking that on, of whether it be with solar and storage or fuel cells or other devices, of essentially taking on their own reliability as they experience things like Sandy in Northeast, and where people realized they had to really take it in their own hands.
Favorite country answer? Fiji.
Fiji.
I'm involved I'm on the board of a company there that's taking microgrids across the South Pacific, and it's awesome because the economics are just ridiculous. They're killing diesel grids and blowing it out of the water in terms of returns and bringing clean energy to these communities. And it's symbolic, I think, in a way that's very significant for small island states to be able to take advantage of the technology.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of work at BNF on basically markets where there's a weak grid and the backup is principally diesel, and I think that's a great opportunity. I owe you one.
Sure. Arthur Halbenstock with 8 Min Energy.
Whoa. Oh, Arthur, okay. Okay, next, definitely. Okay, go ahead, Arthur.
Sure. Arthur Halbenstock with 8 Minute Energy, and thank you all for your insights and for being such a great inspiration always. I'm thinking about SB 350. California is a great leader under SB 350 and the Integrated Resources Plan. All the proceedings are supposed to align to reduce carbon, finally working together to achieve the most important goal. It's going to be years before it produces any meaningful results. In the meantime, the technologies and the businesses that you're talking about are moving ahead at light speed. What do we need to do to try to get policy to match the speed of innovation? How important is it that we do so?
I think it's really important. Your point is good that we can have these moments of political vision and set a mandate, but then, the regulatory carapace kind of kicks in and causes it to maybe not live up to the full potential and timeline. And one of the great things about SB 100 is that it would bring forward the 50% RPS from 2030 to 2025 just to keep juicing the market and keep driving that agenda. Because the world over, the truth is the regulatory construct doesn't match the technology. And so we're actually creating friction from the local level through the systems that community choice and so on are trying to defeat to the highest level. And you've asked a big how can we kind of question. We need to elect leaders that understand it and get them to be ambitious, I think.
Yeah, I think there has to be political will. There has to be massive communication at all levels of society. But I do think that some of the indicators we're seeing that consumers will drive toward this, and they'll mow you down if you stand in their way. And things like electric cars that are more accessibly priced now. Just at lunch, several people said, "Oh, I have an electric car. I love it." And once you drive an electric car, you don't want to go back. Something that came out this week, the solar roof. A lot of people love their cars. I think even more people love their homes, and that will become kind of an it product. And they don't care about locational strategies. They just want a really cool solar roof. So I think that if you can mash up the regulatory and policy directives with very shiny products and that consumers get a choice about, I think that's really accelerating and unstoppable.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned, Sam Deskin, you mentioned that the oil and gas companies are sniffing around and trying to get a sense of the market and try to see how they can use their people in useful ways. Is there a way that we all can guide them in that direction and sort of get them to move faster in that way and stop the progress and stopping the progress that we're trying to make?
Well, of course, nothing succeeds like success. Some of these investments that they're making, if we can get some early wins that drowned out the naysayers that no doubt exist in those organizations, that will do a lot. That's why it's so important to have these highly visible wins, because for every win, you get a whole, wing full of people that have said no, 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 to actually either say yes or at least be quiet. So.
I'll be blunt and say that, I think the oil and gas guys right now are sort of dead man walking. They are the utilities and coal companies of the last decade, and they are sniffing around, it's true, and they're sort of dabbling, and their internal dialogue is probably quite robust, and it's almost schizophrenic. The young folk they've employed want to make the move. The old folk want to just do what they did. They're making money doing it. They're also wasting ridiculous amounts of money. The Bloomberg analysis that you do annually on the stranded assets at different oil price levels, there are billions of dollars. That thing where, was it Shell that went up out of Seattle and was blockaded for a while before being able to get into the Arctic, went there for 6 months, sputtered a well and went bust, came back. $7 billion burnt in 6 months, like that. So how do we get them to stop this behavior? I think we divest from them. We just have to really seriously move the money from wasted effort, and if there are the inklings of a thought that what we did in the 20th century may not be what we do in the 21st century, they'll move if we take the money away from them.
Yes, sir.
Rick Brown, Terra Verde. Danny talked about the regulatory friction. It makes me think of my dad, who was born in New York and therefore didn't learn to drive, until he went into the Army in 1939. And the way he learned to drive was to have his left foot on the brake and the right foot on the gas. And so, you know, our cars, our brake systems had to be replaced pretty regularly. That's kind of how regulatory policy in California is right now, to be honest. I know we've been talking about how great California is, but Peter's point about getting from 50% renewables to 100 in terms of the grid, the California policy right now is putting the brakes on the development of a DG infrastructure. In the last 5 years, every single decision has had something in it that is killing DG. We need to have distributed generation. We need to have DERs to be able to have the lower cost non-wire alternatives to create the grid that goes into the future. Or we're going to be spending billions and billions on hardwire that we don't need. And I'm just wondering what you guys are going to do to, you know, I know Nancy gets involved in policy stuff, but this is one of those sort of wonky issues that doesn't get a lot of play. But I'm wondering, you know, the grid piece, I'm wondering what you guys think we could do to elevate that issue and really push much harder to get the awareness that the DER, DG infrastructure is going to be critical to making the grid work at 100% renewables.
Well, there are so many things that need to be done. You know, I think we're all doing our part, and we just need to be louder and more effective. I mean, one thing that we've been working on is to open up the data that exists in the utility infrastructure to encourage more innovation and, you know, explain to us why an interconnection cost is X and it takes this long, because that's a black box and it prevents a lot of this DG from being built in a timely manner. And there's Senator Skinner has introduced a bill on this. So, you know, we're not moving as fast as any of us would like, that's for sure. But there's no one else in the country that I know of that's, you know, writing a bill like that. So, and we could say that across the board, I think.
Angelina has to have a word.
Yeah. Angelina needs a word. Sorry. But being the person that is actually on the grid on the board for operating the California grid, you're right. And we've always said we need regional integration and a backbone grid, but we need all the building blocks on the distribution side as well. And point in case, we had a stage 1 emergency about a week ago, which we haven't had in years. It was because the solar that was predicted to come online didn't, and we had a drop of about 2,000 megawatts towards the end of the day. What did we rely on? DR. And you have to give credit to the California grid operator because we do have the vision, and we're actually planning for the 50% and actually looking at 80% at this stage of the game. And to Peter's point, yes, it's going to be a totally different ballpark. It's no longer about lowest cost. It's about making sure that everybody is a good grid citizen and everybody can be integrated. DER showed up in 10 minutes, 800 megawatts, just like that, at reasonable prices. They don't always show up. We've had mechanisms where we test them every now and then, and they fail to show. But in this case, they showed. And if this is a practice that continues, I think the aggregated market that the ISO has, allowing anybody over 500 kW to aggregate and participate in the market, is going to be a product that is very successful, and pricing will come. We need good pricing mechanisms. We need the data for good pricing mechanisms, but we will have those market improvements and we will have those innovations in the energy marketplace to be able to integrate DER, distributed energy, energy efficiency, as well as a much better operated and optimized regional grid. And it'll take all of this together to make sure that we get to the 100% sooner rather than later.
Can I ask one last question, please? I was waving way over there, but I was way behind you.
All
You
around
couldn't
the
see
room.
me.
I do apologize.
We've been
now
trying
we're
to
in line
avoid
of
it.
sight.
Isn't it time?
Yeah, my name is Jack Brower. I'm from UC Irvine. And I kind of want to focus our attention a little bit on something that Peter introduced, which is this last percentage that will become, I think, a different strategy that we need. And I agree, and especially early on, that this electrification plus a small amount of storage is really what we should be doing today. But what should we do in the future to meet some of these demands that are really impossible? I mean impossible to meet with just solar and a bit of storage. And we heard a little bit from Professor Gold about some of those applications, shipping, long-distance trucking, and these kinds of things. But I think even the grid, going from 80% to 100%, can't do it with just a little bit of storage and solar. So I think that we have to open ourselves up to, first of all, understand that there's a really big role for the grid to play there. There's also a big role for the natural gas system to play there, I think. And those are the things that are going to enable us to really get there in the end. I don't want to prop them up. You guys were saying, that's not necessary. Let's look at the technical features we need to get from 80% to 100%. And some of that's going to involve a lot of transmission stuff, so we can do the regionalization, so we can move power throughout society really easily. Some of it's going to be to move some gas around, you know, some fuel around. Not fossil, but fuel. And this, I think, is how we have to envision the future, that it has to include some of these other things that are beyond just electrification, from my perspective. What do you think of that?
I'll offer. I think to come full circle, I think, first of all, we're doing exactly the right thing by having this conversation now about 100% renewable. Just asking a question and dealing with it head on, great place to start, because that wasn't the case before. I think, you know, a couple things that show up to me is predicting the specific solution. That's unlikely, but creating the conditions is the right thing to do. And you know, you'll be just surprised at what people come up with. I mean, I think that's. Yeah, but I think, you know, there was from a modeling perspective, I think Dr. Eike Weber, who's in the audience, he showed a scenario, right, that was of Germany. Yeah. And you might have noticed in all the numbers, there was, you know, approximately, please correct me, it was 80 gigawatts of load in Germany, but it was, you know, many-fold that of wind and solar. Yeah. So that's a different model for us, and there are those kinds of things as one possible scenario. But I guess I'll just offer that, you know, I rode here this morning. I departed to my hotel in a ride-sharing service, and I came back in a conventional taxi, and I was struck by the difference in experience. But I also thought, you know, before we all had ride-sharing, we lived in a paradigm where we just accepted that it was totally normal, that the only way you'd get to the airport would be with a medallionized, very regulated process. And when there was a new model presented, we as a society just chucked that out the window. And I think those are the kind, I don't know what that's going to be here, but I am keenly interested in what that might be.
Well, and you see the handwriting on the wall when you have all of the casinos in Las Vegas, you know, chucking their utility out the window and having to pay $86 million to do so, but saying we can do this better.
Yeah. And cheaper.
Cheaper. And Microsoft paying $23 million a few weeks ago to unhinge.
They're going on, basically leaving the service territory. They're using the wires of, say, NV Energy, but they're doing their deals with Tenaska. I mean, so they're buying cheaper because Tenaska is giving basically a better price. They were getting screwed by NV Energy.
I would just say,
I love those guys.
In answer to the gentleman's question, I would just offer, I don't know the answer either. I think that's why we're all here. But I actually don't agree with you that gas is inevitably part of it. You've just answered the question, even though you said you didn't know the answer. And I think you sound a lot like the coal industry just 10 years ago sounded. And you know, I believe quite firmly in my crystal ball gazing, which I try not to do very much, but 100 years from now, I have no question it's 100% solar and wind. I think there is a winner that takes all, and it's the DERs and storage that we've been talking about. The question is, how long do we take to get there? There's no rational world in which digging up stuff from underground and burning it with thermal processes to pollute and create climate change continues.
Opposite of what I said. I did not say that.
But
I said, okay, so I agree with you, 100% solar and wind. That's where we absolutely must go. Even if you don't, I mean, I agree with you. But I think there are ways to use the gas system to make gas from that solar and wind and deliver that. That is my idea.
I wouldn't foreclose.
Yeah, pardon?
I wouldn't foreclose on that.
Okay.
I think a big question would be, what do the utilities that own all the pipelines want to do with those pipelines? You know, if they find better use for those right-of-ways and others, you know, it could change the game.
Heard something about not foreclosing, and it's time for us to actually close.
Yeah. Okay. First, let me thank Nancy, Peter, and Danny, and the rest of you.
And job.
And Diane will have the last word.